Ambassador Aubrey Hooks has been with the Foreign Service since the early 70s.
1971, and I was very young.
He was very young. And he has been ambassador to Poland, ambassador to Israel.
Working in the embassy at that time.
Okay. He speaks fluent Hebrew. He reads Hebrew still. He speaks fluent Polish. And his French is absolutely superior. He was, and that's a technical term as far as I'm concerned. Uh, and he served as ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kinshasa, prior to this assignment in Ivory Coast. Before that, he was U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville. And he's been in Ivory Coast for a little over a year.
9 months.
Oh, 9 months. And it's a 3-year position. And who knows where the government will send him next. But we are very privileged to have Ambassador Hooks to speak to us today. Thank you.
First of all, I would start off by a word of thanks to the officials of the university for inviting me, and particularly to Professor Thompson, who has arranged this program today. When I was in high school, I dreamed of coming to BYU to study. I never quite made it here. Other plans took me elsewhere. But I've valued my association over the years coming to BYU, and I appreciate this opportunity of renewing that friendship today by coming to talk about Côte d'Ivoire. I'm here basically visiting with family, but I thought I would take advantage of the opportunity for those who are interested to talk about 2 things today. One is Africa in general, but particularly the case study of Côte d'Ivoire in terms of the forging of a national identity and security issues. And then the other is to answer questions about, for those of you who are thinking of the Foreign Service as a career option. Since I've been in now for 34 years, might have some useful commentary to make. I would also like to take note today that I see 2 former mission presidents that I have worked with in different corners of the world, one in Poland and one in Bangui, I believe. And it's a pleasure to have a chance to see you again and see you here. I first went to Côte d'Ivoire, where I'm now working, in December of 1999. At the time, I was the director of the African Crisis Response Initiative, which is a program to teach peacekeeping skills to African military. I did the organization, the coordination, the political aspect of it, the diplomatic aspect of it, but the actual training was done by U.S. Special Forces out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And when I arrived, the situation politically was was beginning to become more and more tenuous as they were heading off for elections in the year 2000. And one of the things I was particularly sensitive to at that particular point was training of soldiers. I did not want to be training soldiers that might participate in a coup d'etat. As you recall, when we have trained soldiers in the past in various other capacities, Congress gets very upset when people we train get involved in coup d'etats. And so I was quite sensitive to this particular point. And I recalled extensive discussions which I had at the American Embassy, which I now head, at the French Embassy, which traditionally the French have been the most important country in Côte d'Ivoire, and with the Ivorian government officials as well. And one of the things that impressed me at the time was the unanimous views across the board that a coup d'etat was simply unthinkable in Côte d'Ivoire. And there were a number of reasons for it. Cited were, among others, the fact that there was no precedent in Côte d'Ivoire. Unlike many other countries in Africa, there were a series of coups d'etats. There had never been one in Ivory Coast. This was in 1999, 39 years into independence. Furthermore, the military was very small, unlike some African countries, and therefore played a very small role. And thirdly, it was well under civilian control, so that a coup d'etat was simply unthinkable. I left Côte d'Ivoire somewhere around December the 10th, 1999. On December 24th, as I'm sure as you've done your homework, there was a coup d'etat. The government was overthrown. One of the lessons which I drew from this, of course, is that in Africa, the unthinkable can happen. The unthinkable does happen at times. But I think what we have to do is to put what happened in 1999 in looking at a process that's been underway really since independence. In fact, you can look at the roots of which go back in time. But just from the point of view of independence, it's the forging of a national identity, which is the key element. The second part is sharing of resources. And it's a process that has had to gone through various stages. It's still a process that's very much underway. It's taken rather dramatic aspects in Côte d'Ivoire, perhaps more so than some other countries, although many countries still remain vulnerable to this process. Having been in Congo-Kinshasa before I came here, they're going through a similar process, although I find the one, frankly, in Côte d'Ivoire to be more worrisome and more troublesome because I think it's a deeper crisis. It's a question of identity. Who is Ivoirian? And it was summed up in the word in French, ivoirité, which is difficult to translate, but basically has to do with being Ivoirian. And this is a fundamental question which I'll get into to explain basically what led to this. It has an ethnic dimension, it has a regional dimension, and it has a religious dimension. Although many of the actors go to great pains to try to explain that is not true. But all these elements, nevertheless, are undercurrents that sometimes come eddying up to the surface of the political situation there, and they're very much part of the process. If you look at the history of the country, this was a French colony, which had been carved out in West Africa. And the first president was Houphouët-Boigny, who had been president of the National Assembly in France. He had been a minister in the French government of Charles de Gaulle, and then he became president of the country. But in spite of his many years of experience working in French governments, he was not exactly a Democrat, and instituted a one-party system that ruled Côte d'Ivoire. He did so in a rather benign fashion, and therefore he was forgiven many of the excesses that might have been the case otherwise. He also had two policies which have now come to the fore and are a critical part of this process of forging a national identity. And the first of these is, unlike many other colonies in Africa, he did not chase out the French. He in fact kept the French there, not only in business, where they dominated, but also even in government itself. His chief of staff was French. His secretary was French. And there were French advisors in all the ministries. The result is that there was very little of a shock to the system, and therefore the government continued to function very well. And Côte d'Ivoire, as a matter of fact, for a long period of time, was regarded as an island of stability in a sea of insecurity. And this continued up until 1999. But there was a second aspect besides the high-profile presence of the French and the underpinning of government by French technical assistance. The second had to do with the fact that the population itself was rather small, somewhat between 3 and 4 million at the time of independence. Côte d'Ivoire is primarily an agricultural country. For agricultural countries, much as we find here in the United States, you need migrant workers. And so this was encouraged on an extensive scale from neighboring countries. Today you have a situation where you have a population of about 16 million people. Half of that population is foreign born. Many of them, because of the citizenship laws, and I won't get into all those technical details, but it's very difficult to acquire citizenship. And being born in the country, unlike here in the United States, does not confer citizenship. So as a result, you have half the population, sometimes second or even third generation, that do not have citizenship and therefore cannot participate in many aspects of economic and political life. And this is part of this problem now of trying to forge a national identity. It gets into the question of what degree of ivoirité that you are. For instance, to qualify to be president of the country, and this is a major political issue now, both your mother and your father have to have been born Ivoirian. So this, of course, excludes one of the major candidates, which is part of the reasons for the crisis today. But we have, for instance, 3 million Burkinabés from Burkina Faso. We have 2 million Nigerians. We have 1 million Ghanaians, nearly 1 million from Mali, and then a smattering of those from Liberia, Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Mauritania and other countries. But it does lead to a serious issue in terms of what the national identity is. And this process has been exacerbated over the years. The Ivoirian dream went very well in the 60s and 70s. The economy was growing. Côte d'Ivoire, by the way, exports 40% of the world's cocoa, so it really is the chocolate capital of the world. And as long as the economy was booming, migrant labor was coming in, things were going very, very well. When you developed a policy of fostering a small elite in country. He wanted to create a middle class, economic managers and so forth. And so as a result, he developed a very exploitative system. For instance, the price of cocoa, which is the major export crop, the farmer gets somewhere between a third and a half of the world price, generally closer to the third. Many neighboring countries, the price is much higher, which means, of course, the people sometimes, those who live along the borders, try to export their coffee, illegally, of course, to neighboring countries. But it does mean that you build up an elite in Abidjan. If you travel into Abidjan, it's really one of the most beautiful cities in Africa. It's built around a lagoon, so it's spectacular in its natural beauty. But you also are struck by the fact that it has an infrastructure which is unequal elsewhere in Africa, with the possible exception of South Africa. You have tall, tall buildings that make it the pride of the city of Abidjan. You have well-developed roads, which unfortunately now are beginning to show a lack of support, lack of maintenance. The climate there is very unforgiving. And these tall buildings, for instance, that you see that make the city center look like downtown Salt Lake in some respects. Now, of a bank of 8 elevators, you're fortunate if 2 are working. Probably only 1 is working. And these are the consequences. In fact, elevators, as we know, are very, very high-maintenance items. And these are some of the early precursor signs of a deteriorating economy and of a country in difficulty, in fact, slowly spiraling downwards, politically, economically, and socially. And, but as long as the economy was growing, that was fine. But starting in the late 1970s, the economy began to slow down. This led to serious problems, which became exacerbated in the 1980s. And as the economic problems became exacerbated, so did the political ones. At the time when Houphouët-Boigny died, he stayed in office for 33 years. When he died, the question of succession came up, and that then brought forth much more to the forefront than had previously been the case, this question of ivoirité, who is really Ivoirian. And in 1995, one of the leading candidates was disqualified from running because he could not prove that both parents, as a matter of fact, were born Ivoirian. And this, of course, led to considerable political tensions. As I mentioned a little earlier, ultimately this process that had been underway now for quite some time of trying to forge a national identity, but raising serious questions about that identity, as well as a deteriorating economic situation, again, the question of the sharing resources, came to the forefront. And you have to see the successful coup, in December of 1999. I have to put it in the context of this process that has been underway for some time. You have to also put in the same context of this process of forging a new national identity, the elections of 2000 that took place that were grossly unfair, where fraud was widespread, and which 2 of the leading candidates were disqualified because the general who took over after the coup, and I might add, interesting enough, this coup was staged, organized, and planned not by the general, but by the sergeants. The general was brought in primarily as a figurehead, but he was clever enough to hijack the coup over the coming weeks and basically took power for himself, and then proceeded wisely to distance himself from the original authors of the coup. He was clever enough to do that. He was not clever enough, however, to steal the elections. And so as a result, even though he tried, this was not accepted by the population, and he ultimately he declared himself victor. Basically, public demonstrations led to his accepting the final results. But what had happened in the process here of having 2 of the leading candidates, including the previous president, disqualified, is that a dark horse, an opposition leader who was representing a small minority ethnically, which is important, from the West, which is also one of sort of the neglected areas of the country, who then was able to win power in those extraordinary circumstances. And that has further added to this problem again of who is Ivoirian. He has now adopted this question of ivoirité because it suits his political purposes, and he plays it to the full. And this, of course, led ultimately, again, part of this process here of instability and trying to deal with this question of identity, led to a failed coup attempt in September of 2002. Failed, but only partially so. They were able to divide the country, so about 50 to 60% of the territory, the northern part of the country, is occupied by the rebels. 40 to 50% in the south is controlled by the government. So the country's divided. UN forces are there, with what they call a zone of confidence to separate the two forces in between. And so this is sort of the situation that we're in. As you can imagine, the impact on the economy has been quite severe, and it's led to many businesses leaving the country. We then bring us up to November of this past year, 2004, when the president decided that he had never renounced the military option, even though he'd signed a ceasefire, and he decided to try to bring an end to the conflict. He launched an attack on his own, and this led to, at the same time, this is an attack which was badly planned, badly executed, and basically failed very quickly. But he needed a scapegoat, and so he blamed the French. As a result, the French military were bombed. The government claims it was an accident. The French claim it was done on purpose. I'm more inclined to think that there was more than an accident involved in this process. And as a result, the French retaliated, destroyed the entire Air Force for all practical purposes, a small Air Force, as you can imagine, but immediately led to vast demonstrations, looting and attacking of French citizens, evacuation over the next few days of about 9,000 to 10,000 French people, leading to the fact that the managerial class, much of the business sector, disappeared overnight because much of the businesses were still in the hands of the French. It also led to the schools, all the French schools were burned and looted, and to which, of course, many of our kids also went. This was a severe blow also to the economy and has led to further spiraling downward of the economy. Now, we have gone into a situation where we have a peace process, and I think it's interesting in the peace process in Côte d'Ivoire, which is somewhat typical of peace processes elsewhere. It tracks very closely with the peace process in Congo as well, where you have, there was an initial attempt on the part of African states to try to broker a peace agreement. This did not work. The French then themselves took the effort to do this in what was called the Alliance-Marcoussis Agreement to try to broker a peace agreement, a ceasefire. That was then endorsed by the United Nations, and that became the basis of a ceasefire agreement in Congo and in Côte d'Ivoire. The problem is it has not worked very well. There's a great tendency whenever there is a conflict to reach an agreement, even a bad agreement, so that when you leave these peace negotiations, you have something in hand, and it's not a failure. But the problem is sometimes a bad peace agreement is almost as bad as no peace agreement, because then you have to live with the consequences of it. And then in many areas it was deliberately vague, so that people could agree to a text. The problem is, and this became a major issue in Côte d'Ivoire, is that when people go back home after the conference, they each have their own interpretation of the peace agreement, which means the process remains an impasse. And this is a repeated problem. Lately, the latest version we have had as part of this process has been the African Union, particularly through the mediation of President Mbeki of South Africa, who has entered into the process, has negotiated a new agreement, and has corrected some of the previous problems by announced that he himself heretofore, or henceforth, will be the arbiter of the interpretation of this agreement. Now, I think when we look at peace agreements in conflict in Africa, it's a little bit like landing an airplane on an aircraft carrier. As you know, there are basically 3 wires you try to catch. And if you miss one of the 3 wires, as soon as you hit the runway, you immediately full throttle so that you can take off again. And for inexperienced pilots, this happens quite frequently. We're dealing with inexperienced actors in the political process. And so as a result, we've had many attempts to land on this aircraft carrier of peace, if you wish, only to find that we missed all 3 of the wires that were there and had to circle over many times. This, I think, is part of the process of trying to reach peace agreements in many parts of Africa. As I mentioned earlier, it was the same phenomenon in Congo. It is certainly the phenomenon now in Côte d'Ivoire. The thing is now we are headed off to our elections, which are mandated for October. Much will depend, of course, upon the goodwill of the political actors to respect their commitments. Heretofore, goodwill has not been in evidence, and so as a result, people sign agreements and they don't respect them. As I mentioned a little earlier, if we get to elections this year in October as mandated, we'll have a difficult year. With much tension, there's always tension, even in the United States during elections, but in Africa there's a great deal of tension, which I'm sure will spill over into violence at various times. If we do not get to elections, bear in mind I said we'll have a difficult year if we get to elections. If we do not get to elections, we will have a very difficult year, because we then get into a constitutional no man's land of who is the legitimate government if you don't have elections. There are mechanisms in the Constitution, but the opposition has already announced that they would not accept the current president as being legitimate after October 26th, which would add another element to the process. But what we have here again is there are some fundamental questions which cannot be addressed, but which still linger on the surface, and that is, who really is Ivoirian? And how do you become Ivoirian for those who, the immigrants that are there, are sometimes second and third generations? How do they become Ivoirian? The laws are such that it's extremely difficult to acquire nationality. And the current president and his party are not eager to facilitate that process, because they think that most of the foreigners favor other candidates. And so as a result, you have a country that's still struggling with this identity. And the political divisions in the country do fall along ethnic lines. In fact, that's probably the single most potent force in Africa, is the ethnic background. Regionalism also has plays into the factor. And in Côte d'Ivoire, it's interesting, you have a country that's almost equally divided between Muslims and Christians, with a mixture of animism in there as well. And that falls along the north-south divide of the country. And so that also enters into this question. And the effort currently, of course, to dismiss the primary candidate that represents the north, that represents Muslims. And so this leads to the current standoff. Our hope, of course, is that we will get to elections, and that they will be sufficiently legitimate. Again, we have to put it in the Ivorian context, that there will be some degree of legitimacy to the government that will be formed thereafter. The role of the United States in this process, we've had a very unusual role, because initially, when I first arrived there in August of last year, our policies at that point were to support the French, who were what we call the lead country. They had a large peacekeeping force in the country, to try to move the country toward elections, which we always have seen as the emergency door out of the crisis. For a period of time, it looked like that door would be blocked. In the meantime, there's been such a rupture between the French government and the Ivoirian government that the French can no longer play the role of lead country. And this leads to serious complications for the French, who are in the process of trying to develop a new policy, which has not yet been fully formulated. Also for the United States, because given the fact that France will remain an important country there, although following the events of November of last year, it will no longer play the lead role it played in the past. But nevertheless, for us to be able to try to be supportive of the process, we need to know where the French are, so that's a big question mark that remains there still. But our policies are at this point to strongly endorse the African Union's efforts to try to reach a peace agreement and to get to elections. This will not solve all the problems, but what it will basically do is allow the Ivoirians in perhaps a quieter and calmer environment to start addressing these fundamental issues of who really should be Ivoirian, how foreigners who are there can acquire citizenship, and how to address these questions of ethnic complications, religious complications, and regionalism. I might mention that Côte d'Ivoire, again, was the most francophone country in Africa. Unlike many other African countries, there is no national language. In Congo, where I was, there were 4. And in Côte d'Ivoire, there's none. As a result, the quality of the French is very, very good. In fact, there's a process now where particularly children in the urban areas speak no African language, which is generally associated with the backwardness and the poverty of villages, and not as a useful asset to have. But it means culturally, of course, that children are deprived of their roots to some degree. And this is a phenomenon which is increasing, particularly in the large urban areas. The country is about 50% urban, as a matter of fact. And all of this is part of this process of trying to establish who will be Ivoirian and where that country is going. I myself am deeply troubled by the fact that the fundamental issue in Côte d'Ivoire is one of identity. In other countries, in the question of Congo, for instance, identity is not the fundamental issue. There it only applies to the question of Rwandan speakers, who constitute less than 1% of the country, and therefore it's not a marginal issue for the Tutsis and the Hutus, but it's a marginal issue for the country as a whole. In Côte d'Ivoire, it's the fundamental issues to be addressed. Who is Ivoirian? Who can participate in national life, and who cannot? And that's why I find it I remain deeply concerned about that country, because I don't find the political will there. I find the political leadership do not understand the gravity of the situation. They, I think, are blinded by personal interest, by narrow ethnic interest, and do not recognize the fact that the country is not, it's in a sort of an unequal status quo unequal equilibrium. It will not stay this way very long. Something sooner or later will happen. If we get to elections, this can be a way out. If we do not, we will continue to downward spiral for some time until something, whatever that something can be, can happen. The something, of course, can be defined in various ways. It's something that's generally not wise to define too closely because it gets into things that we don't wish to encourage. But in this smaller group, I'll mention that in Congo, if you recall, in 2001, early 2001, everything was blocked in that country. The UN deployment was blocked, no relationship with IMF, World Bank, difficult relationships with potential donors. And then there was the assassination of Kabila Sr. And his son came into power, different generation, different mentality, much more open, and things could turn around completely. So the something can take all type of forms of that you can imagine, but are unforeseen. But I hope that we will get to elections this year, but I still remain very concerned and worried over a country that is grappling with the fundamental issue of who belongs to that country. Thank you. Now, I'll be happy to answer your questions, again, of whatever area you would like to talk about, Africa in general, security policy, Cote d'Ivoire in particular, as well as questions about the Foreign Service. Yes, sir.
Last week there was a program that aired on KBYU that was made with help from the Kennedy Center about Islamic fundamentalism and from the Middle East and debate in the United States about whether to shore up militaries to make friends in Africa against those types of movements. Do you think that Muslims in Ivory Coast are susceptible to Islamic fundamentalist groups?
Yes, although not as much as you might imagine. And there are two factors that we have to look into the Muslim question. One is the foreign Muslim community, composed primarily of Lebanese. There are somewhere between 60 and 80,000. There used to be 200,000 or 200,000 plus Lebanese, but given the deteriorating situation, many have left, insecurity and deteriorating economy. And among the Lebanese, the Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon is rather well organized. In fact, outside the Middle East, the major source of funding for Hezbollah, again outside the Middle East, is from Cote d'Ivoire, because people there are encouraged to contribute to Hezbollah, encouraged by many different ways, as you can imagine, and they contribute rather heavily to the funding of Hezbollah. So that is one thing. The local population tends to be less fundamentalist. There's a strong element of African animism involved in both in the Christian religions as well as in the Islam. But clearly that is something that where they could be susceptible, particularly given the fact that they're among the poorest parts of the population. As you can imagine, as part of our policies there, we have a charm offensive to try to reach out to the Muslim community, to both to establish contacts with them, explain our policies, as well as try to engage them in dialogue. Yes.
You discussed lines of separation in Cote d'Ivoire, and mentioned the north-south line and the religious separation. I was wondering. You also mentioned ethnic differences, and I was wondering if you could expound a little on the ethnic differences and whether those run along the same lines as the religious differences, or whether they cross lines as far as religion and ethnicity go.
They cross lines, as you can imagine, and in Africa, people are much more relaxed about religion than perhaps in some other areas. You have families, as a matter of fact, that where you have some members are Catholic, some are Protestant, and some are Muslim. President Bagbo explained to me, as a matter of fact, that although his father was Catholic, he had converted to evangelical Christianity, both he and his wife. So this can happen without serious and dire consequences, and it's unlike many other countries, people are quite relaxed. But in Cote d'Ivoire, you have a north-south divide, where the north is primarily Muslim, the south is primarily Christian. Again, there are exceptions to that. At the same time, you have the ethnic considerations. The largest ethnic grouping is the Akan, of which the largest clan within that is the Baoulé. President Houphouët-Boigny was Baoulé, which is probably the largest single ethnic group, although still a minority within Cote d'Ivoire. But out in the west, you have the Beti. And prejudices exist everywhere. And the Akan saw themselves as the aristocrats, the rightful rulers, the nobility, so to speak, whereas the Bete were regarded always as somewhat more primitive, much more aggressive, much more warlike. And so these issues do come to the fore. They were not part of the Houphouët-Boigny entourage, and therefore, although you'd always find representatives that were involved in government, but by and large they felt excluded from national life. And they felt they were excluded from both politics as well as on the economic front. And in Africa, many of you probably know Africa well, but in Africa, being in government is critically important in terms of economic well-being, because those who are in government or have strong government ties have access to easier money and are much more successful economically, whereas those who do not, you're generally out in the cold. And this therefore means that elections are critically important because you don't have a private sector option that you can go to very easily. Unlike, let's say, here in the United States, where serving in government can be, in some cases, a financial sacrifice for people. There, people make fortunes overnight in the government, whereas in the private sector, that occurs much less frequently. And in the private sector, the successful businessmen tend to be those with ties to the ruling authorities. And one of the things now with President Gbagbo is that as he has come in, a sizable portion of the economy is in state hands, and naturally he has appointed directors from his Bete group to head those institutions where corruption is rampant. But it does mean, therefore, that when you give up, when you lose power, you also lose your livelihood. And so it's more than just ideology plays a very small role in many places in Africa, and certainly in Cote d'Ivoire. It becomes much more one of ethnic background, as I mentioned earlier, regional, religious, and to some degree economic. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ambassador. I had the chance last summer to intern at the U.S. Embassy in Kampala, and I was there when they signed the tripartite agreement in August. And it was interesting for me to see the U.S.'s involvement in Africa nowadays. What do you think, why is the U.S. so much more involved nowadays than in the past? Do you think it's because of the end of the Cold War? We have more, I don't know, resources to put into other parts of the world, or the bombings of the embassies? What do you think, why is there this bigger interest in Africa?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for it. The world's getting smaller. Globalization has reached all corners of the world. Some issues, of course, do not recognize national boundaries. And I can mention one issue, which is a major issue for us in Cote d'Ivoire, one of AIDS. The largest infection rate is in Africa. In Zimbabwe, where I spent some time, it's 35% in the 15 to 49 age category, which is horrendous. In Cote d'Ivoire has the highest prevalence rate in all of West Africa. It's 12% or so. I would emphasize any statistics that you hear from Africa you have to take with not a grain of salt but a barrel of salt. They're more sort of indicative than actually of a trend rather than of actual pattern. And so some of these issues are major issues. On the question of global terrorism, which is a major issue for the Bush administration, as you can imagine, we have to bear in mind that the African continent has not been immune from acts of terrorism. If you recall August of 1998, when the American embassy in Kenya was blown up, at the same time the American embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania was blown up. So we see that we can be victims of terrorism in places in Africa as well. Not only in terms of being victims of acts of terrorism planned and carried out largely by outside elements, sometimes, however, with cooperation from local elements. Also a recruiting ground with people of a different profile. If you're looking for Middle Eastern types, whatever, those who don't fit into that Middle Eastern type might be able to slip under a different radar screen. And so you have to take that into consideration as well. So there are many issues that now I think give an importance to Africa that perhaps it didn't have before in a strategic sense. Bear in mind also that Africa is important to us economically. I think now about 12% of our petroleum imported comes from Africa, mostly along the west coast. Yes, sir.
With the assassination of Kabila and then his son taking over the presidency, it seems to have opened up the country economically. Certainly the church has built things like 3 stake centers since then. What has caused that opening up that it was so restricted before?
Joseph Kabila is, as I mentioned, a different generation. He's a very different personality from his father. He's much more open. And although the economy has really not taken off yet, he has been sufficiently reaching out to the other elements that he was able to form a coalition government that brought in all the various rebel groups. The country was divided into 5 different parts. And the government's not functioning terribly well. But I think they're going to get to elections not in June as originally planned, but perhaps within a year's period of time. But he has been much more open, reaching out to the IMF World Bank, very cooperative with the UN forces that are there. And so I think he has made a tremendous difference in that process. At the same time, of course, there's been a greater relaxation of government control of various areas. And they're much more open now, I think, to the fact that various types of associations, organizations, and churches are playing an important role in society. It is floating, yes. It is floating. And there have been moments of stability, moments of fluctuation. It hasn't done so radically because Joseph has emphasized, has introduced a stabilization program that would have met the approval of the IMF, but he did it on his own, which has stabilized the currency. Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the current president, Laurent Gbagbo. I've read that when he came to power, when he was elected, and then he received pretty broad support during that election. The hopes were pretty high for him to be successful. I guess he had a fairly good resume, and it was widely believed that he would, if anybody could make the system work, it was him. I was just curious, from your perspective, what is it that made him, rather than extend the hand to Ouattara and kind of invite him into political participation, what caused him to continue the policies of his predecessors?
I don't quite buy your analysis of Laurent Gbagbo.
Okay.
I would say that, first of all, the elections, as he himself described the elections, the conditions were catastrophic. He initially, President Gay declared himself winner. Gbagbo complained it was massive fraud. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court declared Gbagbo the winner, 53%. But there's only about a 40% turnout of eligible voters. There's a great deal of intimidation. Those elections were hotly contested, which is one of the reasons we have the problems we do today. And that led, as a matter of fact, to the attempted coup in year 2002. He initially reached out to various other elements to bring them into the government. But it was more in a nominal sense than an actual sense. Bear in mind that in Africa, particularly in the presidential system, the president is almost all-powerful. And you can bring people into your government, but it's really the president who makes the decisions. So you didn't really bring them into the power-sharing arrangement very well. Secondly, I would say that Laurent Gbagbo has a long history of association with the use of violence. He is the one who founded the FESI student organization, which has a long history of violence and intimidation, and now basically controls and intimidates the university campuses, both of them in Abidjan. And in fact, it is 2 former presidents of that FESI student organization who play leading roles in the political life today. The rebel leader, excuse me, is Guillaume Soro, former FESI president. The leader of the young militias is named Charles Blégoudet, who was Soro's successor as head of FESI. It's the young militias who are responsible for the death squads, who are for intimidation, who are the ones who looted the homes of ministers associated with the opposition, who looted opposition newspapers in November. So I would say there's always been sort of an undercurrent there of violence. On the one hand, he knows the vocabulary of democracy and of socialism, but in fact, the practice has fallen somewhat short of that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious about kind of the question of the economy of Congo, more about Côte d'Ivoire. I know President Boigny, he spent a lot of the country's money back when he was in power. I was curious, when did the economy, or what was the cause of the big collapse of the economy, and what could be the future recovery? Is there potential to get the economy back where it was, and Ivory Coast could be a tourist place again, possibly?
When I speak of Cote d'Ivoire, both in a political sense and in an economic sense, I never use the word collapse or crash. And what we have here is a long-term process. And what is happening is actually a slow process. If we looked over the political process over which it goes back really to independence, we have seen how over the years we have sort of reached to where we are today. I don't expect the country to fall apart during the course of this year, even if we don't get to elections. The economy itself has been in somewhat of a slow downward spiral. The pace of that has accelerated in recent months, but it is not a situation where the economy has just collapsed. It's by and large an agricultural country, and cocoa, for instance, accounts for about 25% of budgetary revenues. This past year was by and large a record year, independent of political events. And so as a result, you have a situation where the investment climate has seriously deteriorated given the insecurity. Businessmen don't like insecurity. Money, as we know, does not like risk. As a result, there's no new investment, which means there's no new creation of jobs. And many of those who were there have moved their businesses elsewhere, to Dakar, to Accra, to Nigeria, or elsewhere. And so as a result, you had the withdrawal of some of the economic actors from the country. Again, it's a slow process of just downward spiraling. Okay? Yes?
Could you describe in a bit of detail your perspective on the influence of an American embassy in a third world country and the influence that you as the ambassador can exercise?
Interesting question. And I think the case of both Kinshasa and of Abidjan have been extraordinary cases. Because given our role in the world in general, the United States, of course, always has a role to play. But in an African country, particularly an African country in crisis, the role of an American ambassador can be a critical one. For instance, if I were ambassador in Copenhagen, wonderful and beautiful city, but things are basically on cruise control, and things sort of move along, and you have meetings and so forth, but you don't really have a real impact on the way things are going. Whereas if you're in Kinshasa, you play a critical role. I was one of the few people, for instance, who had ties with all the rebel groups and with the government, and frequently, as a matter of fact, served as a bridge of communications between those various groups. Visiting rebel groups in their headquarters, flying all over the country to do so, involved in peace negotiations. People want to have the approval of the United States, want to try to portray the image that somehow they're friends of the United States. And so as a result, they are always trying to court the American embassy to be a part of that process. There have been various periods of time in the past, of course, when there was anti-American feeling, and throughout much of Africa now, there is a very strong fascination with the United States. That was certainly the case in Congo, to the point that my driver had to be careful with the flag on the car because people like pull it off to use it as a bandana. And in Cote d'Ivoire now it's particularly the case. This, however, has a certain sensitive element to it in Cote d'Ivoire. When I drive through the streets, a lot of the people wave. There are two parts of it. One is there's a genuine fascination with the United States. People want to study the United States. At the same time, and that's a very good element, but at the same time, there is an effort, given the anti-French feeling, to try to make them jealous by sort of flirting with the United States. And so I have to be very careful in this process, that on the one hand, I maintain good relations with all parties, and I sue everybody, but at the same time, not turn it into an anti-French statement. And therefore, I have to walk a very, very careful line in doing so. As you can well imagine also, all the political actors would like to have the American embassy support their particular position. That is not our role, something which I have to avoid very carefully. Because if you become associated with any particular grouping, then you lose your credibility with others. And so as a result, I listen, I give counsel and advice, occasionally scold, but don't subscribe to any of them. They all have, of course, their problems. And I think they all contribute, and I occasionally tell them so. They are contributing to the fact that they're tearing their country apart. But so the role of an American ambassador can be, in a situation like this, it can be a fascinating role to play. Thank you.
I also had a more personal question. How did you become involved in the Foreign Service, and how did you get involved in Africa and moving from Poland to Africa?
When I was a sophomore in college, I had a political science professor who stopped me in the hallway once and said, have you ever thought of the Foreign Service as a career? My first question, of course, was, what is the Foreign Service? And she explained what it was, and I found it fit exactly what I would like to do in life. I'd never traveled very much, but I read voraciously travel logs and history. And I thought traveling, getting to know different cultures, learning different languages, living all over the world would be an exciting lifestyle and something that would appeal to me on a professional basis. And so I shifted my major from history to international relations, ultimately went into economics as well, and signed up for the Foreign Service exam, which is given once a year, and passed the oral test, invited for an oral exam, the written test, did the oral part, then was offered a job and came into the Foreign Service, and so here I am. How to become an ambassador? Generally on the career track, well, there are two ways of becoming an American ambassador. There's the easy way and there's the hard way. I did it the hard way. What's the easy way? The easy way, of course, is to give $500,000 to the winning presidential candidate, and you can become appointed. And about 40% of ambassadorial positions are reserved for political appointees. These are generally English-speaking, safe countries, oftentimes in Europe, but not exclusively. And so that is one way of doing it. The other way, the harder way, but perhaps the more interesting way, is to come in the Foreign Service and start off as a vice consul somewhere in an embassy and work your way up through the years. And I came back from Poland in 1995, and I was offered the opportunity of going to Brazzaville as ambassador. I'd never served in Africa before, but I'd actually planned to do something before I reached that stage, and I thought, why not, if the opportunity is there, go for it. And it has been fascinating ever since. By being in Brazzaville, where we had a civil war, ultimately we had the embassy was looted and the country was torn apart. That then turned me very rapidly into an African specialist. And then with the African Crisis Response Initiative and then Kinshasa, I've sort of taken that track. And it's been, in a career sense, it has been far more interesting than being in some other areas because of the role that you can play. I think we have a question here.
Mr. Ambassador, how do you become a pessimist about Africa based on your experiences there?
No, I've not. I think I'm a realist, and I hasten to always add a couple of points. One is people oftentimes refer to Africa as if it were homogeneous, and even Africans will sometimes say, I as an African. What does that really mean? Because Africa is a continent of diversity, of enormous diversity. And if you travel around the continent, you will find that people, for instance, in South Africa are very different from West Africans. Those in Central Africa are quite different. Ethiopia is a whole different story on the east side of the continent. So tremendous diversity. Secondly, the continent itself is, we oftentimes, because it gets into the news, it's sort of the CNN factor, the crises get into the news, but there are also success stories. South Africa is a success story. You recall back in the early 1990s, people were worried that as apartheid was, the question of what to do about apartheid and how do you bring in the power sharing arrangement, there was great concern that South Africa, in fact, would fall apart and that would be torn apart by violence. That's not been the case. The transition has had its problems, but by and large it has been very successful, and so that's a very good success story. Mozambique, which went through a long civil war, is actually a modest success story. Kenya, in spite of the corruption, has had reasonable elections, and that's, you have to look at it in the context, that's a small success story, but important. Senegal, where they've had a sharing of power. One of the major things in Africa is that succession of power is very difficult, because once you become chief, you're chief for life. That's the sort of the culture there. But you've had a few distinguished leaders, which Mandela is one, but before him even, Senghor in Senegal, and Nyeri in Tanzania, agreed to step aside. Unfortunately, one of the problems in Ivory Coast is that Houphouët-Boigny never did. And so as a result, the succession was never properly dealt with. But we do have success stories. Ghana is a modest success story in the sense of a successful democratic transition within the African context. So it's a mixed bag. And I would emphasize in that respect that I do not think progress is going to be linear. Some of those countries that today are stable may not be tomorrow. I cite the case of Ivory Coast. For a long period of time in the 1990s, Ivory Coast was cited always at the top of the list of this is a model for the rest of Africa. Stable, prosperous, and all those good things. We see now it's now in the category of being a bad poster boy, so to speak, for the rest of Africa by the fact that it has gone in a different direction. But so I think we'll have an uneven march. In some places, improvement. In some cases, deterioration.
One last question.
Okay.
I was just wondering what the I was wondering what the dynamic was between the State Department and the CIA in foreign, especially in Africa. If and if, as an ambassador, if you have any say in what the CIA's activities are in that country. Yeah.
Do you think I can really reply to your question?
Is it a pleasant relationship?
Do you really think I can reply to your question? Well, let me reply nevertheless to your question. We obviously have a very good working relationship with the CIA. They are not present in all countries, but they're present in some countries, in some cases declared, in some cases otherwise. And they are within the embassy, they're part of the embassy team, which the ambassador presides over. And so you are informed of all that's taking place, but you also decide when things will be done or not be done. And so you can block or you can approve. You provide counsel, you provide guidance. That's your role there. And so within that framework, there's a very close working relationship.
At the risk of exceeding the number of questions, can you please comment to this young group about the church, the relationship of your religion and your role and the church in Africa, perhaps?
Are we all members of the church here? Well, I have a great story that I like to tell about how I came into the church. I came into the Foreign Service primarily because of the church. And when I went to the oral exam in 1971, in those days the oral exam had a different format than what it has today. But basically I was invited in front of a panel and went through a whole series of questions, probably for an hour or so. The real purpose of it is to, not so much to test your knowledge, but how articulate you are in a stressful situation and how you handle yourself. And the very last question to me was, you're a vice consul in South Africa. Bear in mind, I didn't know what a vice consul was exactly. And a young South African has won a scholarship, a tennis scholarship to the University of Utah. And this was just sort of the setup. What can you tell them about Utah? Now, the purpose of this question, I was from South Carolina, was to test my knowledge of the United States. And so they chose a state that naturally someone from South Carolina would know little or nothing about. And they could have chosen South Dakota. It would take me about 3 sentences, and that would have explained my presence. But they chose Utah. And so I started, I had never been to Utah at that point, but I had read, a number of church books. All the missionaries in those days, certainly in South Carolina, I would say at least 80% were from Utah, with another 10-15% from Idaho, and then a scattering of Arizona, California, and so forth. They were basically my age, so I got to know them very, very well. And so I proceeded to give the history of the church. We walked with the hand carts across the plains. We built the temple. We went through the whole history of the development of the valley, to the extent that I knew it at the time. And at the very end, I could see, this was a sort of throwaway question in a sense for them. As I went through this, initially they were just sort of politely listening, and then they became quite fascinated because my first question was, how much do you want to know? Everything you know about Utah. I proceeded to tell them and explained about the church and the role of the church in Utah and so on and so on. They were quite fascinated, and I could tell they were following with interest. How does this kid from South Carolina know so much about Utah? And then at the very end, as I was coming to wrap up my summary, I debated with myself, do I tell them I'm LDS or not? Will it give authority to what I have said, or will it create problems for me? And so at the end I decided I would say that I'm LDS. And so at the very end, as I wrapped up and said, and being a Mormon myself, there were 3 thuds on the table as their chins bounced. There was a great deal of surprise. The summary of that is being a member of the church is never a problem. It's always an asset. And in the Foreign Service, that's certainly been the case for me. And I think that particular question, as a matter of fact, made the difference in terms of my getting through that oral exam. Because therefore, it'd been okay. I had answered most of the questions, felt reasonably comfortable, but they were looking for more than that. They were looking for something to, you know, for you to stand out, so to speak. I think that is the question that made the difference. No way, of course, testing that hypothesis, but that's what I felt at the time. And so I think being in the Foreign Service today is because of I'm a member of the church. Over the years, of course, not drinking, alcohol. When I first came in the Foreign Service, many people drink. Wine was always served. But that was never a problem for me. Once you make that decision, it's not a problem. And it just became a question of people getting used to it. I can tell you from my experience, if you're LDS, you don't have to advertise it. People will know it. And they quickly discover that you're LDS. But it is not a problem. In fact, I recall there were times when people would say, I know you're not drinking, so I will also take something else. So it was always an asset. Plus, I would say that particularly for those of us who live overseas and work in different environments, when you arrive at an American embassy, you have a built-in social network. But with the church, you also have an additional network, social network, and gives you other friends that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so many of my friends over the years, my closest and best friends have inevitably been church members, some of whom here now in the Valley, which is one of the reasons I come so often. So it's always an asset, never a problem. Thank you.